Hello, and welcome to the Chaplain's Compass, a podcast for and about interfaith chaplains on navigating spiritual care in practice. I am Alicia Tremaine.
And I'm John Betts. And we're really excited to have this team here. There's a new article that just came out in the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy, and its title is A Mixed Method Evaluation of Implementation Determinants for Chaplain Intervention in a Hospital Setting. We have some of the team members who helped write that and helped participate in that research, and I'm really excited to have them. As part of that, a lot of what this goes into is the idea of CBCT, which is cognitively based compassion training. And the actual intervention is compassion-centered spiritual health, which is a spiritual health application of cognitively based compassion training, which we'll go into what those are. But we're so excited to have this team. I'm not going to steal your thunder. So present today, we have Maureen Shelton. Maureen is an ACPE certified educator and director of education and training at Emory Spiritual Health and director of the Division of Compassion-Centered Spiritual Health, or CCSH, in the Woodruff Health Sciences of Emory University. And we also have Jennifer Mascaro. She's the associate professor of preventative medicine, the lead scientist in spiritual health at Emory Spiritual Health. And we also have Kim Palmer, one of my fellow Transforming Chaplaincy fellows. And Kim is a member of Emory's research team in spiritual health, who is a semi-retired but still very much engaged in the work being done at Emory Spiritual Health. So it's great to have you all here.
Nice to be here.
So just to begin with, I love hearing people's stories, like especially within the field of chaplaincy and spiritual health and in becoming a certified educator. People's stories are very different. So I'd love to hear, what brought you into spiritual health or chaplaincy, and how has your role changed to where you are today?
I came into ministry sort of as a life career change after having been an engineer in the environmental consulting business. My mother had gotten cancer. She had lung cancer. It went to the brain. She had to be hospitalized for the time and then discharged into a nursing home until the end of her life. And I took a leave of absence from work and spent that time with her and got to know, all the ladies in the nursing home who were there. And when she died and I came back to corporate America, it felt very flat. And I had already been sort of casting about for what might I want to do that I felt like was more important with my time. And I thought, I'd like to be a chaplain. I'd like to serve the sick and dying. And so I got the MDiv. I got my CPE training at Emory. And then a few years into that, there was the opportunity to participate in the Transforming Chaplaincy Fellowship. And through that, I got a Master of Science in Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology. So learning how to do robust quantitative research, and back into Emory after that degree to work on the research team.
Wow, what a big change.
So I come to this work as a researcher. I'm an anthropologist by training, and my research interests have always been trying to understand the brain and body and contextual factors that help us feel connected to others. So how is it that we come to feel compassion and empathy for others? And how is it that we come to feel held in care and compassion by others? And so because of that interest, I come to that interest as an anthropologist because anthropologists really are attending to the idea that all of these things that we think are quintessentially human differ and vary and are so context dependent. And so I've always been very interested in those questions, but in particular when compassion is very difficult and very important. And so that led me to this calling to do research in the context of serious illness. But when I first began on that sort of pathway, I frankly didn't know much about chaplains. I had some personal experience, but it was a very impoverished understanding of the depth of what healthcare chaplains do. And so I had this incredible fortune of meeting George Grant and Kim Palmer and Maureen Shelton, and had my eyes opened to the fact that if we're wanting to understand how people feel held in care in the context of serious illness, healthcare chaplains are deeply, deeply important and a wonderful place to understand that and to conduct meaningful research. And so that's sort of the winding path by which I got here.
That's great. I see a through line with a lot of your stories in that there's a lot of hope in seeing what great things, how chaplaincy can go from where it is, and spiritual health more so, and bringing it to a next level where it's more evidence-based, where we're relying more on good research, quantitative, the qualitative, and just being able to tell our stories well.
I think that's very true. And from my very limited research-focused perspective, the opposite is also true. And by that, I mean, there's this incredible richness that I think what chaplains do can offer the research world, because the research world is clamoring to understand these big topics, and so much that can be learned. And to me, that's also a hopeful sort of way of looking at it.
Oh, that's great.
For a long time, compassion, empathy, and similar things have been considered soft skills or the fluffy part of healthcare, and we're becoming more and more aware of the importance of those tools and skills.
Yeah. When I first started out as a chaplain, one of the things that I really needed was the ability to continue to develop my own self-awareness so I could have that resiliency, being able to have that self-awareness to go, oh, I need to get in the right mindset before I can minister to others. Yeah, that would have been a great tool to have in my bag.
Yeah, John, I like hearing you say that. One of the things that I really appreciate about CCSH and CBCT is the stories that come out of the chaplains that we've worked with, who don't just prepare the care responder before they go into the room, which of course they do, but it's being in the room and perhaps being triggered by something, or perhaps having a crisis escalate, and being able to check back in with yourself in the moment as many times as needed in the middle of your consultation in order to sort of come back to a place where you yourself are operating out of groundedness and you're able to keep your options open and your awareness open for what's needed in the moment and how best to help the person who you're providing service to.
There's this idea of the action reflection piece, very much where you're in the midst of it when you're present in the room. And it's not just when you get outside of the room, but it's when you're present and experiencing, oh, I'm having a reaction to this. What's happening? Okay. Am I able to stay in the moment? Yes. Okay. I'm staying here. Oh no, I need to go.
Yeah, that's wonderful because, in CPE, I remember when we have that reflection part and we look at our verbatims and our experiences with patients, we did that retrospective reflection on what were you thinking at the moment? What were you feeling? But this gives a tool to exactly how to access that in the moment. So that's wonderful. Jenny, can you tell us more about this article in the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the wonderful things about what we get to do is that we have a really large team of researchers. So we have psychiatrists and religion scholars and scholars of public health. The gift that brings us is a wealth of expertise and different types of methods that we can bring to the research. So, if we are wanting to ask foundational questions about what chaplains do or what patients need, we can leverage the ideal tools to study that. If we want to study the effectiveness of CCSH, we can leverage tools to study that. But here in the article that we recently had published, we're bringing a slightly different set of tools that are often coined or referred to now as implementation science. So implementation science is sort of a buzz term in the field of public health, but it's based on ideas that have been around for quite a while, which is that if we have an intervention or a policy or some change that we think is going to be effective and we're bringing into a new location, if it hasn't been studied in that new location, we need to have a really systematic and theory-grounded way to study this thing in its new location. So we need to study who the different actors are or stakeholders are in bringing that to the new location. We need to study the system. We need to study the culture that it's being brought into. And so that's what we're trying to do in this paper. We're trying to leverage some of the tools of implementation science to try to understand, okay, well, we think CCSH is going to be an effective approach for chaplains during ACPE. But we want to understand, first and foremost, what are their attitudes? What are their thoughts going into it? What are their beliefs about interventional approaches in general? And then after they go through the program, can we start to understand the factors? So the motivational factors, or the psychological factors, or the social factors that influence how they learn and how they engage with and use CCSH. And so those are some of the questions that we have. We can talk more specifics about what we found. And I'd love for Kim to join in too, because she was so integral in this research as well. But we sort of think of the paper as a tale of two halves. So can we understand the spiritual health residents before they even embarked on compassion-centered spiritual health training? And then afterward, can we understand in really rich detail, what were their motivations? What factors lead into their decision-making process when they go into a patient's room? And what are the influences that they notice affected how they learn and how they use CCSH?
Exciting. So what did you learn, Kim?
Well, I want to start off with just some of my own kind of understandings about implementation science. It is a little buzzwordy, but the way I kind of think of it and why it's important in the field of chaplaincy, right, or spiritual care, is if we come up with what we think is a really good intervention, which I think CCSH is, then it doesn't matter how good it is if people won't use it. It doesn't matter how good it is if the people who you're trying to deliver it to won't receive it, right? So it's important to do that upfront study and figure out what are these factors that go into making it successful, and are there barriers, and can we reduce the barriers and kind of leverage the facilitators so that this can be effectively brought to bear in our care. The thing that I know Jenny mentioned, one of the things that we looked at was the decision-making process on when do I use CCSH and when do I not? And of course, in a residency, we think of it as being sort of a fire hose of information that comes to people when they're getting trained. So our folks have gotten trained in CBCT, which is in itself a lot to absorb. They're doing the CBC practice on their own time, hopefully keeping up with that and deepening their own understanding and ability to access these insights. And then they've also learned CCSH and are engaged in using it and coming back to reflective sessions to better understand how to access and use that. And one of the things that kind of struck me that came up in our chaplain interviews were the reasons for using or not using CCSH in the moment. And so some of those, for example, were based on just familiarity with it. So people who felt unsure, didn't really know how to use it. They would say things like, I'm required to do it once because I have to write my reflection paper, that kind of thing. But there was some reluctance to kind of dive into it because it wasn't really fully understood. It takes a while to absorb, and you have to sort of practice it and think about it to get fluent in it. But there was also this element of who the care seeker is. So if our spiritual health clinicians were rounding on their units and they went into a room and introduced themselves and the person said, "Oh, I'm doing great, I don't really need anything," then there was confusion about how can I even use CCSH in this case? Like, they don't need anything. I don't want to just stand in the room and kind of force something on them. So it was really when people were using it is when they found care seekers who were in distress, or when they had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with a care seeker and sort of explore what was going on with their experience in a little bit deeper of a manner. Then they were able to see, oh, this is where these insights come into play. This is where I can ask some open-ended questions about the care seeker's experience and maybe apply some of these insights that I learned from the compassion training to sort of bolster their own resources and how to cope with their situation. One of the stages of CCSH, the last stage, is entrusting the care seeker. And that's essentially kind of reviewing with the person what has come up during your consultation and saying, here's some insights we talked about, or here's some practices that you might want to consider or that you already engage. And that when the spiritual care clinician leaves the room, that person still needs to continue walking on their journey. So it's a way to make visible what some of these resources are as they continue to move forward.
To add on to Kim's observations and summary of things that we found, one of the things that really struck me was sort of a bookended finding whereby, one of the things we're really interested in is this question of how did residents think about interventional approaches in general before they even embarked on CCSH training? And in the literature, there's sort of mixed results when that question is asked. In other words, there are times in research studies and I think anecdotally as well, where chaplains and residents will be hesitant about interventional approaches as possibly something that would be inflexible, that might not allow for the sort of human connection and spontaneity that is so important with a patient or a care seeker. And so, we really were curious about that. And we found that by and large, the residents, even before learning much about CCSH and being trained at all, were by and large quite amenable and excited about an interventional approach. Not totally across the board, but almost across the board, were pretty unworried about a lack of flexibility. But then on the bookended side, the other end of this, after they learned CCSH, this question and importance of flexibility and of flow came up a lot. And so this is connected with what Kim was saying, where training became so important. In part, training was so important because there was such an emphasis on wanting CCSH to feel natural, to feel a part of a flow, to transition very naturally and seamlessly, and for them to feel like it was sort of a part of them. And so, I think that's not at all at odds with their pre-training notions of it having the flexibility that would be important to them. But they were sort of emphasizing that at every turn, that flexibility and a feeling of natural flow is incredibly important for what they do. And that CCSH was in part something they liked because it allowed for that. And as they were trained, they felt more and more comfortable with that sort of naturalness.
Yeah, I remember reading on the article that it allowed for their personalities to show through, which I think is very important for chaplains. But I have a question. So for these chaplains in the research or those practicing CCSH, how are they introducing these practices to patients? Are they actually calling it CCSH or compassion-based, or they are introducing it another way, or does it depend on the interaction?
Yeah, I'd love to give sort of an example out of my own experience of what you're talking about. And that's an experience of encountering a fresh widow after the death of a patient. And, there's a lot going on in the room and a lot of emotion. One of the ways to kind of keep somebody grounded is, or even for the spiritual care provider to ground themselves before or in the midst of an encounter, is this idea of resting in a moment of nurturance. And so instead of saying to a new widow, hey, I have this meditative practice I'd like to teach you, it's part of CCSH. What I did was I said, how did you and your husband meet? And she begins telling me the story of how she met her husband. And you can see, the shoulders relax and you can see the smile come, and talking about, some of the misadventures in their early days of dating and so on. And what has happened is that I have facilitated then a person really reaching back into their memory about a time when they felt comfort and safety and joy and love. And then they're able now to kind of self-regulate by tapping into that remembered experience. And so then I may have an opportunity later on just to mention when I'm concluding my encounter and I want to entrust this person to carry that skill forward, I may say something like, I saw that you really seemed to relax a lot and find some peace in your heart when you were telling me about your husband and how you met. These are memories that are available to you at any point. If you begin to feel overwhelmed or if you're feeling particularly sad, you can always reach back into your own memories and sort of rest there in a moment so that you can, feel that connection again. So this is a way of sort of introducing some of these concepts and techniques without saying, okay, now I'm on step 6, so I'm going to do this and I'm going to tell the person it's CCSH. That's not what we do.
That's a wonderful example.
That's a great example, yeah. Jennifer, you'd mentioned a phrase that interventional approach. How does that differentiate? Because Kim gave a great example of an intervention that was provided to the fresh widow, and you said that some chaplains aren't used to an interventional approach. Could you tell me more about what an interventional approach is and what other chaplains might think, because my own bias comes in and I go, oh, I know some chaplains where they say, oh, I'm going in and I have no agenda. I'm just going to be present and I have no interventions. Is that what we're saying?
So intervention becomes a tricky word. The further you dig into it, so it has a very specific meaning in a research world, like with the National Institute of Health, as almost anything that you do that you think is going to affect people. So they have a very loose use of the term intervention that is very consistent with CCSH. So when we write grants, for example, to the NIH, we are free to call it an intervention. Now, the term gets used differently in the literature on chaplaincy. Kim and I noticed this quite early, where a lot of times in chaplaincy, the word intervention is used essentially for anything that they're doing with a patient versus a sort of standardized anything that the NIH would call an intervention. For a chaplain, it might be just a name for an activity. And so we're sort of using the terms differently there. The other thing that arises is sometimes a mistrust around the word intervention. And back to that idea we were talking about earlier of an inflexibility. And so sometimes we split the difference and call CCSH an interventional approach to connote this is not reading out of a manualized textbook to people, right? So the use of the term, we have to be very careful about how we're using it, how we're defining it, and the context that we're using it in. But to us, CCSH very nicely qualifies as an intervention as the NIH defines it. But it is in many ways different from the way the word intervention is used almost colloquially in chaplaincy literature or in spiritual health literature. So that's just where we sort of come down on that term and try to use it with as much precision as we can.
Yeah, I'd like to add into that kind of my own understanding of the interventional approach and how that relates to the interventions that you may select within it. And the approach itself is one of sort of maintaining awareness of self, awareness of other, going in with a sort of a plan to prepare myself before I enter the room even, right? So that's a stage of the approach. And then once I'm in there, this kind of constant evaluation of what's going on inside me, what's going on with the other person, how can I maintain empathic balance so that my story is not getting so loud that I'm wrapped up in it and can't be present? And how do I prevent their story from getting so loud that I'm drawn into it and can't be effective because now I'm there's a term for that, which I can't remember right now, but I'm kind of like wrapped up too much in their emotions. So this, the approach, right, I feel like is one that allows me to go in and maintain my awareness and make an assessment, and then to consider what my options are on what insights I have from CBCT and what I've learned through CCSH and what I have from my previous experience and what I'm seeing in the room. So if I go into to speak with somebody who's just been bereaved, one of the things that I do in my approach is I consider, what is my own experience? Like, oh no, this person, I'm feeling overwhelmed. This person is weeping uncontrollably. So how do I calm myself so now I can remain present and address what's in the room? And then as we move through our encounter, things like, what have I noticed about the person's demeanor, about what I see in the room, about maybe things that they've already said to me, so that I can evaluate whether, for example, inviting a nurturing moment about how they met their husband is going to be something helpful, as compared to, say, somebody who is feeling conflicted about the death and is interested in the money from the insurance and is glad that they're finally gone, right? So you have to be careful. You can't just do a one-size-fits-all intervention. The approach itself is one of kind of constant evaluation and back and forth.
For our listeners, chaplains who maybe have been practicing for a long time, what are some tools that maybe they can implement immediately that would improve their personal practice or chaplaincy? And how can they learn more if they are curious about CBCT?
I have a colleague who has now had CBCT. She's looking forward to taking CCSH in the public course. But she began her journey by stumbling across a recommendation for watching these videos of our fellows who do their presentations on how CCSH has been incorporated into their care. And she said it was life-changing. She's been a chaplain for a long time. She said that this was something that made a giant improvement in her own practice and in her own awareness. And John, you had mentioned also the kind of the historically standard position of chaplains is, we know I go in without an agenda. It's not a manualized approach where you go in with an agenda. If I have to go through these 8 stages or steps and I have to somehow shoehorn in these 6 particular things, it is not agendaless. I mean, it's based in awareness and developing skill to be able to see what is it that's going on. What's the primary source of the distress that I'm seeing in front of me? What are the options I have for being able to draw from some kind of compassion-based skill that this person would be able to bring out of their own experience and be able to take with them when they go. So it's sort of in between no agenda and a strict agenda, right? It's a very fluid, flexible, personally modifiable way of approaching. I guess that's why I think of it as the interventional approach, right? It's being very intentional about what am I seeing in front of me and how can I best address that based on the insights that I've developed and the skills I've developed.
So Jenny, I'm curious now, since you've been so interested in studying compassion and now being part of this research, what practices have you taken to your personal life? What have you adopted as a result of your studies?
So I began with some personal interest in contemplative practices back all the way in high school. And that's part of why my research career sort of morphed into this, because I had a personal interest primarily in mindfulness and Vipassana practices, really for stress management, all the things that we want personally. And so I continue those as best I can. The compassion practices that I became aware of, I almost think of it as dumb luck, because CBCT was beginning just as I started graduate school at Emory. I was so fortunate to be kind of in the right place in the right time. And so the compassion practices deepen that so much because they really do build off of that sort of mindful awareness. And back to Kim's point about agendaless versus not agendaless, well, compassion practices, especially CBCT, they're considered an analytical meditation. They are not necessarily just about observing with clear eyes what is. They build on that. But there is so much about the intentional awareness of our knee-jerk biases to categorize people as friends versus enemies, as someone who's with me or against me, and of the biases we have of, as a parent, I'm going to do this for my kid, maybe at the expense of that kid. These are intentional ways to notice those biases that we are all hardwired with. And so those compassion insights and practices have really been transformational for me. And I really do think of just this incredible fortune that I have that to be in a place where I can sort of make that my career, to study that and to sort of be exposed to those practices.
Going with those practices, I always want to make sure that what we're doing is not just an American thing or just a Western approach. How is this not just an Emory thing? How is this larger than that?
John, I think there's a couple of ways that this also ends up being suitable for global use. One is that it's flexible enough to allow the application of your own sort of worldview through it. It's not just American or just a particular, just Buddhist or just secular, right? It's flexible enough that you can kind of fit in your own approach to it. The other thing that makes this really a globally useful approach is that it's dealing with really basic human characteristics. Jenny mentioned us being hardwired for bias. There's also, I think, a hardwiring that I often see where somebody has a great deal of distress about something that they don't really have any control over. And it's because our brain can't tell the difference between, facing off with a lion that wants to eat us and being faced with a procedure in the hospital that we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so it helps to be able to understand how our psychology and how our mental processes work so that we can kind of tend to those and provide care that provides relief through these compassion practices.
The thing about CBCT that I've seen is that if you want to do CBCT badly, think that you're doing it badly. because it's very trauma informed. It's about where the person is about how are you engaging with the practices in a very trauma informed way, and how are you engaging with these very common things a lot of people need, the idea of self-compassion, the idea of expanding your circle of concern outside of just the people that are in your quote unquote in group, but at the same time not saying, oh, I should be doing this. It's more of, I get to do things. Oh, how wonderful.
What do you envision or hope for the future of spiritual care with the context of CCBT and CCSH?
I would say my hopes for the future are that more people encounter this or encounter people who have encountered it, because I don't think there's many people out there saying, oh, it's a waste of time, don't bother. So I think it's likely that it'll continue to, have legs and to become a resource available to others. And then I do have a hope, as well, for people to sort of like recognize that this is helpful for their personal lives. I was really struck by one story of a chaplain who said that she had taken these, these training modules, the CBCT and the CCSH, and then noticed with this increased capacity that at home she was always irritated at her husband for, doing the dishes the wrong way or not putting them in the dishwasher right, or whatever it was. And that she had this sudden insight that it's not that my way is right and his way it's wrong. It's just that we have different ways. And she was able to just accept that and let that go. And she said this would have been a long, festering resentment that had kind of bogged her down in her marriage, and it was just gone. And so there's lots of stories like that too, where people are more able to self-regulate, more able to see how to interact with others, to be, to provide helpful interactions. And it's great to see both in the field of spiritual care and in the effect that it has in people's personal lives.
If we're talking about the same person, Kim, I remember one of the quotes was something like, I realized I still love my husband. Amazingly transformative. I would say because this approach has been informed by and built upon research and evidence at every stage, the optimistic future that I see is around the incredible momentum of research in spiritual health and spiritual health in research. And so within the field of spiritual health, there has been an incredible call from really visionary leaders to incorporate research at every stage, but also to incorporate chaplains at every stage of research, and for them to be not just research literate, but partners in conducting research and in guiding it. And then, when we look at what makes research go around, which is often, the NIH, there is an incredible emphasis there and realization of the importance of spiritual health as whole person healthcare. And I think that really does become a momentum, because now it's something that is fundable. It's not automatically tossed into the garbage bin by reviewers who are shy of the word spiritual. There's a real realization that if we want to do good clinical science and good health research, we have to do research on spiritual health, and that has to be a part of what gets funded for clinical trials. And so, to me, that's sort of the optimistic future of spiritual health that I sort of see from my tiny little corner.
I can appreciate as well the kind of the increasing importance of this kind of flexible, religion neutral, interventional approach, as more and more people are religiously unaffiliated, and for many people, they don't have a church home or a local faith leader who is supporting them through their difficulties. And it may be that the chaplain is the person that they encounter who is able to address these needs. And that might be the only person.
No, I agree. I think that's what's such an important piece, especially as chaplaincy is able to provide for the humanists and the so-called NONES, the nuns. But I don't like using that term because it defines what they quote unquote don't believe, but the humanists, those people who don't identify by a spirituality or a religion, it provides that opportunity. And I think that's where chaplaincy, providing those interventions, will be absolutely paramount.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. I think of it as being helpful, not just with the nuns, but the nuns and duns, people who are anti-religious or bristly about religion, right? And there's a bunch of those folks too.
As we're coming to a close We always like to ask everybody, what is bringing you life these days?
I have two answers to that. One is we're fostering some kittens. We call them our election support kittens. We're busy caring for them to doom scroll on our phones. So kittens. And then as a parent of two teenage boys, a close group of friends and spouse who will say, "You're doing a good job. Hang in there. You're doing a good job," no matter what I say and no matter what my worries are. So those are the two things that are giving me life.
John, I appreciate the question. I moved just over 2 months ago from the Atlanta area to Durham, North Carolina, to be close to a niece who had had a baby. She was in Atlanta, and then she moved with her husband and 2-year-old. And I wanted to maintain that relationship, so we moved up to Durham. But I've been privileged to be able to provide some emergency childcare. And as the summer is coming to the close and preschool is starting now, my world is beginning to open up a little bit more. And it's not only having those relationships here with family that are so rewarding, but we're also getting to explore a new area, a new city and what it has to offer. So this has been a lot of a joy for me lately.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kim.
Well, thank you all so much for this lovely conversation today. I know it's given me a lot to think about and a lot of inspiration, and I'll definitely be checking that course out. And we'll definitely link that on our show notes so that other people can find more information and look at those courses and also have a reference to your article for them to read.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to be here with your audience. It's good to see you all.
I'm just ecstatic that y'all were able to join us. So thank you so much for your time.
This has been wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Oh, thank you.
And now it's time for the non-anxious presence with John and
Alisi. John, to me, that was a fascinating and very inspirational conversation. It brought to mind a lot of interactions that I've had with patients in the past or just personal practices, and also to when I was training as a chaplain. And I think me personally, and maybe other chaplains as well, have tapped into some of these practices without necessarily having a name for it. For instance, I remember being a CPE resident and feeling the need to have some kind of practice or ritual before I entered a patient's room. So, I try to come up with a way to do some kind of breathing or mantra or something. And I just didn't have the language for that, which is part of CCSH, as well as that example that Kim was giving of practicing CCSH or meditative practice with a patient. The example that she gave of asking her to describe when she and her husband first met and accessing those memories, that's something that as a chaplain I have really relied on when people are in a lot of distress or anxiety, to be able to say, tell me more about this person or this memory. But I don't know that I would have had the language to explain what I was doing. But also I think what was missing for me is that fourth stage of being able to say, this is what we did, and you may be able to access those memories later for yourself. I love that. So I think that's probably a fantastic tool that I'm really interested in learning more about.
No, you're right. Well, it's funny because when Kim was talking about that situation, the first thing that I thought of was, well, in traditional charting notes, they would say, well, I was doing a life review. And I'm going to step on toes here, but I thought that was kind of a useless term. I engaged in life review. Well, yes, but like what you said, there's much more to that Kim was doing. And Kim was providing tools for the patient so that they could access that moment of nurturance later. And I think you're right. It does provide more accurate language that we can use.
Yes. And self-compassion, to me, that has been so important. Personally, and also in my practice as a chaplain, it's been the most important and meaningful for me as I've been grieving the death of my father. And I remember when I was going through a time where the grief was very acute and I was experiencing also some shame, perhaps, or guilt for sure of not being there for him. Things that I have found that were really helpful were meditation and self-compassion during that time. So that taught me a lot from having that experience of what it can mean also for patients to be able to experience self-compassion and how to help facilitate that for them.
You're absolutely right. In full transparency, I took CBCT and did the instructor's course last year. And to use Barbara Brown Taylor's phrase, I discovered some true holy envy with the Tibetan Buddhist Lojong tradition, as I saw, oh, wow, there's so much of an emphasis on compassion. And like what you're saying, self-compassion, compassion on others. One of the modules for CBCT is expanding your circle of concern. In other words, rather than seeing the people who are typically in your in-group and your own, who you consider to be one of you, to go, okay, well, what about let's expand? What are the characteristics of people outside of that? Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody wants to feel loved. And what about expanding and wishing well for those who are outside of those concerns? And so being able to start practicing that, exploring our biases and seeing people, as whole people, instead of, all too often, people can be reduced to talking points. So especially, I love how Jenny talked about that she has election comfort dogs. Especially during the election, it's quite easy to have people reduced to talking points.
I did find it helpful as a chaplain sometimes to go around the hospital and deliberately do a wish you well walking meditation, where I would walk through the halls and I would just look at people walking around me and just say mentally, I wish you well, is a warm-hearted presence in addition to a non-anxious presence. What did you think about that term?
I love it because the warm-hearted concern and wishing and desiring that good would happen to others, I found that description very life-giving, because it's more of desiring, oh, I might not be able to do much right now, but I could certainly wish you well, and I could certainly desire that. And if it's within my power, then yes, I can do it. It's not this, I think of, some people might say, oh, are we reducing it to what James in the Epistle of James warns? That it's like, oh, I could give you money, I could give you something needed. I'm not going to do anything for you, but I'll give you warm fuzzies. That's not what this is about. It's like what you mentioned, it's going around and wishing and looking at others as, oh, I desire good to happen to you. And if it's in my power, then yes, I have those resources that I could, within, of course, boundaries, provide them for you.
I found it inspiring because it made me think, I want to be that kind of presence to others. I want to be a warm-hearted presence. But I think it also gives chaplains another way of thinking about our practice. We know we help with a non-anxious presence that is very embedded in what we do, but to also understand that what we bring is a warm-hearted presence, someone who is there on somebody else's corner, wishing them well, having compassion. That is so important. And I think we're just beginning to really understand the importance of that. There is a phrase by Cicely Saunders that I have always really appreciated, which is, we are the medicine. So speaking of interventions, you can have, obviously, we need the medical interventions. We need so many different types of intervention, but without losing sight of the fact that it's in that relationship. We are the medicine. The compassion in providing those interventions is just as important as the intervention itself.
Yeah, and what do you think of the research itself? What were your thoughts on any of that?
I found it really interesting because the research was done with CPE residents, and it looked like they were already very adept at reading the room and understanding when to apply these interventions, when not to apply them, and how to introduce it to patients, and that they felt like it was a positive intervention for the patient, but also for themselves. So I think it's a very hopeful tool that it's obviously helping CPE residents, but I think it can be just as helpful for seasoned chaplains, professional chaplains who have been doing this for a long time.
No, I agree. Yeah, it was interesting work that they've been doing. And it's one of those pieces where I find it fascinating because they did a study of, and this was back in, I think it was 2008, 2009. They had an intervention where they had CBCT and then they had like just simple mindfulness, I think. And the CBCT, what they found was people who practiced it 30 minutes or more a day. Part of the entire study was beforehand, they would provide these very stressful, basically to have people get up in front of others, do public speaking, and count backwards by sixes. And they found that there's some biomarker, and they found that the people who did CBCT for more than like 30 minutes or more each day, that their ability to go back to baseline was a lot quicker than those who didn't. So the CBCT was not a panacea of, if you just go through this process, you're good. If you actively practice it and if you are utilizing it in the midst of things, then it can make a great difference. And so I thought that was a fascinating piece on that study. So since CBCT does draw from Tibetan Buddhism, the theology is not incorporated. A lot of the practices are. I thought it'd be very helpful to read from Beyond Religion by the Dalai Lama. He writes, "How then does this process of mental cultivation lead to spiritual and inner transformation? Here it might be helpful to invoke the idea of the, quote, 3 levels of understanding as found in the classical Buddhist theory of mental transformation. These levels are understanding derived through hearing or learning, understanding derived through reflection and understanding, derived through contemplative experience. For example, consider people who are seeking to understand the deeply interdependent nature of today's world. They may first learn about it by listening to someone talk about this issue or by reading about it. But unless they deeply reflect upon what they hear or read, their understanding remains superficial and closely tied to their knowledge of the meaning of the words. Now, at this level, their understanding of a given fact will be only an informed assumption. However, as they then reflect more deeply upon its meaning, applying analysis as well as dwelling mindfully upon the conclusion they reach, a deep sense of conviction arises of the truth of the fact. This is the second level in the process of understanding. Finally, as they continue to cultivate deep familiarity with the fact, their insight into it becomes internalized, making it almost part of their own nature. They have then reached the third level of understanding, which is characterized in the classical texts as experiential, spontaneous, and effortless.
May we find more understanding, your deeper reflection. Blessings on you as you go about your day or your evening. Please remember to subscribe, to share this episode with your friends, and leave us a review or a rating on your favorite podcast platform. That really helps us to reach more folks.
Yeah, and we always love to hear back from you. Please call us and leave a voicemail and tell us where you want future information, future content. So if the phone number is 502-536-7508. That's 502-536-7508. And leave us a voicemail. And thank you so much.